Perfect.
All right.
Thank you.
Now I'm going to
Okay.
show you some slides.
All right.
Well,
And
you're
I
going
will introduce you first. So my name is Tree Ross, and I am the Chief Financial Officer of the Sudbury Green Party of Ontario Constituency Association. And I'd like to recognize that present here tonight is the Constituency Association's president, Pat Rogerson, and also our director at large, Janet Wright. It's wonderful to see you all tonight at our second in what we hope will be a series of such meetings. This evening, we have invited David Robinson to present on economic options and issues to consider as our world grapples with the climate crisis. David is an economics professor and an expert on the Northern Ontario economy. He has written over 150 columns focusing on Northern economic issues in Northern Ontario Business Magazine, and has authored and co-authored 2 books. In addition to these and other accomplishments, he has run for election 3 times as a Green Party candidate. After David's presentation, we will have time for discussion up until 8 o'clock. So David, welcome, and I'll pass the reins on to you.
all right. Well, thank you, Tree, and Pat and Janet for setting this up. I'm just trying to get this thing to become a presentation. Can you now see my screen? No? Yes?
No. No, it's
Hello,
blocked.
Greta.
It's a black screen right now.
Okay, well, that's very mysterious. Let's see if I can figure out. Sharing is paused. Bring your shared window to the front. Okay, but whatever that means, it'll take a moment for me to figure out by the looks of it.
We just saw
Got
something.
it.
We'll stop the share. We'll try again.
Okay.
Can you see my screen now?
Yep.
Okay, well, we'll make it a presentation so that it's, I hope I can make this a presentation. Oh, I see. I've made a small mistake here I think, because I want this to be a presentation and it doesn't want to be a presentation the way I've loaded it. So let me try closing that up again. Let me apologize for that. It worked when I rehearsed it. I promise you it did. Okay. Now I understand it. I have to have the button in sight when I do this. Now could you see it? No?
No.
How about now?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, sorry for that. Thank you, Craig. I need that encouragement. Okay, so we're talking about the circular economy and decoupling. What we're really talking about is the sort of broadest conception of how we deal with the set of environmental crises we have. So, whoops. So here's what to expect in the next few minutes. I'm going to remind you what the problems are because, well, I'm sure as Greens and people interested in this, you already know what the major problems are, but how can I propose solutions until I've actually talked a little bit about the problems? So that's the first thing I'm going to do. I'll show you a few pictures that I think are really quite informative on that subject. And then I'll start to talk about what the 3 solutions are that are coasting around in the environmental literature. They're a big part of the discussion in ecological economics. They're a big part of the discussion in environmental economics. And there seems to me to be a good deal of confusion, even among the professionals sometimes about these concepts, although they're fairly easy. So we'll talk about 3 proposed solutions. I'll do some illustrations. I've got some nice charts that'll give you a sense of what the difference between these 3 ideas are. And then, well, we'll go to a quick summary and some questions if you have any. Is that okay with you, Tree? Great. So let's start with the issues. The 2 biggest issues in the 21st century are, we've got a climate disaster coming. We're not on a path to avoid it. And we're in the middle of the 6th great extinction, which probably has some survival implications for us, but it's an enormously saddening moral issue. Okay, so just 2 issues I want to talk about as the problems that these ideas are, these solutions I'm talking about are aimed at. So here's what we know about the problems. Well, there's really only one answer. What's causing these problems? We are. It's our environmental impact. And what can you say about that? Well, our environmental impact has become massive because there's lots of us. So let's just divide our impact into 2 categories that we need to talk about. One of them is pretty simple, what we dump into the environment. And the big one there, the one that is having the biggest effect. Yes, there's plastics. Yes, there's pollution from agriculture. Yes, there's sulfur dioxide emissions, and on and on and on. But the big one is carbon dioxide from burning hydrocarbons. That's the one that's tipping us over the edge. It contributes a great deal to the threat to our fellow inhabitants of the earth, whether they're gazelle or gorillas or whales. And we don't have to go through these numbers because I'm sure you all know them. We're currently at over 400 parts per million. That's almost 140 parts per million. It's almost 50% higher than the pre-industrial level. And the atmospheric scientists tell us it's just not a stable situation. But we're actually still adding 52 billion tons of carbon dioxide every year to the atmosphere. Okay, so don't be impressed by this graph. It just shows that at Mauna Loa's observatory, as you've seen since 1960, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has been rising. I think it's interesting, though, to think for a moment about Canada's share of that. If we're not to exceed a dangerous level, people have worked out what they call a carbon budget. And that is, it's a big number, it's 572 billion tons of carbon dioxide, and then we're really in danger. 572 billion tons. So it's interesting to think about what Canada's share is, which is about 2 billion tons. And it's interesting to compare that to our annual emissions, which is about 700 megatons. Now, 700 megatons is 0.7 billion. And you guys can all do the arithmetic. 0.7 goes into 21 3 times. There's exactly 3 years, slightly less than 3 years emission if we don't increase our current emissions. Emissions have been sort of stable for a while. So, but that's 3 years from 2019. So if you add 3 to 2019, you get 2022. In other words, at the end of this year, we have exhausted our Canadian share of the global carbon budget. If we were being fair to the world, we'd be saying, well, we've got to be zero in 3 years. right? 3 years. So we've actually exhausted our share is what that means. The other big problem is what we take out of the environment. And here's a nice plot of the global habitats and how they've changed over the last 300 years. Now, these 300 years is the period during which humanity covered much more of the globe and increased its population enormously. So does the globe show changes? Well, on the left, there's lots of that dark green. That's woodland, that's forest. On the right, and we live in Northern Ontario here, Laurie, so we think of ourselves as a forest environment. How much real woodland is left? Well, virtually none in Europe. Huge parts of the woodlands of Africa have simply disappeared. Great part of the woodland in Asia. One thing I think you should notice is that red is the symbol for urban land. When you look at it at the global level, urban land is pretty small. However, yellow rangeland is the land that's primarily used for feeding animals. Okay, so what's the big difference here? That yellow is all part of our food chain. Not only that, the light green is another big chunk of our food chain. So the thing to notice is essentially our food chain has taken over the world. It's not our bodies, it's the inputs, what we're taking out of the environment. I think something that's a crucial point to summarize, there are 2 points. One is we've eliminated most of the global forest already. And the second point is we use most of the arable land in the world to produce meat and food for meat animals. Most of the land that's being transformed in this picture has been turned into meat production. I recently read that the next big environmental war is going to be over meat, and already people in the States are posting pictures of themselves with 4-pound steaks, because according to some apocryphal calculations about what Biden's plan means in the US, everybody gets 4 pounds of meat a month at most. So you can imagine the response. If you want to look for funny memes, go looking for those. Let me illustrate that point just a bit more. If you look at the amount of the Earth's surface that's land, it's that brown bar at the top. How much could you inhabit? How much is really worth living in? Well, you got to take out the glaciers and a lot of barren land, a lot of forest. So about 70% of the land surface is habitable. We use about half of that for agriculture now. Half of the habitable space in the world. Now, one of the things that means is if there was anybody living on that land before, we're pushing them out. Right? Habitable land means animals and human beings can live there. If you cut down a bunch of trees and plant crops or raise cattle, somebody had to move out because you've taken over the homeland. Of the agricultural land, of that 50% of the agricultural land, the land, habitable land that's agriculture, 77% is actually for livestock. Those are big numbers. Those are really big numbers. If you're trying to justify it, those livestock, the 2 boxes at the bottom, illustrates something kind of important. That 77% of the land provides 19%, 18% of human calories. Most of the calories, 82%, comes from plant-based food. And in terms of protein, meat and dairy, despite the fact that they take 3/4 of the land, only provide about 1/3 of the protein that humans eat, which pretty well, it seems to me, provides some evidence we may have gone just a little heavy on that one. Anyway, two problems: what we're putting into the environment, and this is about what we've taken out and how it relates to the extinctions. Okay. I think when you think about meat from now on, I'd like you to hum that song, Bye Bye Birdie, because the birdies are disappearing. Okay, so we've got these two problems: inputs, primarily fossil fuels, I want to focus on, and outputs, carbon dioxide, agricultural waste. Inputs are land and fossil fuels. Those are the two I'm talking about. And here's our three high-level concepts. Now, you might wonder why I'm saying three, because the title of the talk has only two. It has decoupling and the circular economy. So think of degrowth as a kind of bonus issue. I'm going to connect that. So if you don't want, you can just ignore the degrowth one, but it's a bonus. It's free. Okay, these are complementary concepts. I don't want to say you're going to pick one or the other, but I think it's really important that we be clear about which one we use when. As environmentalists trying to affect things, we need to steer the conversation to the most productive places and not let people get off on unproductive tracks. The conversation, some of that conversation is wrapped up in these definitions. So here's one way of looking at the economy. On the left-hand side of this picture, you have stuff coming in. On the right-hand side, you have stuff going out. I don't like the labeling on this, so don't worry about that. If you see that line here on the partway through, somewhere in here, things have been processed into the things that we might actually need. So this is processed materials. Some of those processed materials go into the consumption economy. Here's where we live, in this little box. A lot of those processed materials end up just getting dumped somewhere. They're not used. The part that's dumped out, that passes through the economy, the throughput, well, it's being separated into different categories, but you see that the highest percentage of, none of these percentages are very high. We're not actually using very much. Of 7.4 gigatons of materials that come into the economy, 4.8 just goes out the other end. There's different versions of this graph and there's different analyses of it. But how does this relate to the three concepts we're talking about? Well, if you're talking about a circular economy, you're talking about making that little channel at the bottom, the stuff that actually comes out as waste and goes around and can be reprocessed. You're talking about making that channel really big. In fact, you're trying to make it big enough to supply all of this part, all of the stuff that we actually take in, unless we're reducing what we take in. But if you want to think of it this way, this is the set of materials that we want to replace all of that input with. So it never leaves. Anyway, circular economy is a pretty good idea. What does decoupling mean? Well, decoupling says, whoops, I don't want that. Let me go back. Decoupling is, let's not take anything in. Let's cut what we're taking in and cut what we're dumping out. Got to keep my finger off the keyboard or I'll throw away one of my punchlines. Okay, so conceptually, these are really different ideas. They're working at different places. The circular economy means essentially remaking virtually everything we produce. It's a huge technological challenge. It's a really important idea. Decoupling is in some ways a simpler idea. Can you cut out important parts of what's coming into the economy and therefore what goes out? And the one that we are focusing on at the moment, of course, is fossil fuels in, carbon dioxide out. The amount of carbon dioxide that goes out, 95% from fossil fuels in, a little bit from agriculture and, cows may burp and a few things like that. But the big chunk of the output of carbon dioxide is just fossil fuels in. So that's a focus. The other idea that's out there is, well, we just eat too much. We just eat too much. We've got a fixation on growth. We've got to stop growing and start shrinking the economy. There's a lot of kind of moral discussion about this one, because shrinking the economy means you guys get less to eat. It means people are allowed to have fewer babies. It means enormous interference in the style of life we've become accustomed to. And it means perhaps restricting peoples in other parts of the world who are poor and getting better off, or who are still having children. We can talk about population control, but in Canada, I think you all know Canada's population isn't growing, actually. The only real growth we have is from immigration. So population control isn't our issue. Okay, so 3 ideas working on 3 separate places in the economy. Okay, I'm going to do something that I have to do. I'm an economist, right? As an economist, I have to show you an equation. That's right, Laura, you're laughing. No, I can't possibly let you go without showing you an equation. The equation I'm going to show you was developed by a Japanese energy economist, Yoichi Kaya. And it's pretty simple, but it plays a core role in the IPCC, International Panel on Climate Change report on emission scenarios. This is, if you want, the sort of neat way of explaining what they think we have to do. So there it is. Got it, everybody? Can we go on? No, I better explain this a bit. On the right, I've got emissions. Now, this is unique economic thinking because I moved that equal sign from the other side of the equation because I wanted it to be a kind of throughput story. So what we do is we start with population, with people. And what's funny about this equation that makes it the Kaya identity is that I'm going to write the more people. Obviously, if I put more people into this equation, everything gets bigger, right? That seems obvious. More people, more consumption. But then I'm going to divide by people, which means that the people part's going to disappear. And then the G, which is basically how much everybody eats. It's the G over P is how much people eat. So total output is G. Total energy that's needed to make all that output is that big E. And this last piece, before we get to the equal sign, is how much carbon dioxide is produced by each unit of energy. Now notice what happens. If I cross out the P's and I cross out the G's, and I can't cross out the E's, I've got CO2 on both sides. So this equation doesn't actually tell us anything. It's an identity. Right? If you look at it, P divided by P is just 1. G divided by G is just 1. E divided by E is just 1. How on earth does that tell us anything? Well, it tells us something because it lets us separate out some ratios. So G over P is how much each person consumes. That's standard of living. So what it says is if you have a bunch of people and they all have a certain standard of living, that's going to require a certain amount of consumption, total production. And if you have, E is the energy intensity of this output. So if you produce more, you have to use more energy. Whoops, what did I do? Then, of course, there's the problem that the energy that we use mostly comes from fossil fuels. So there's carbon content or carbon intensity in the energy. Well, cross everything out, and you've got a calculation that gives you the total carbon dioxide. Now, what's important about this for our purposes, and this is the way it's used by the IPCC, is they say, well, you know what? Darn it, got to keep my hand off that. That P, population, isn't going down in the next 40 years. It's not going down enough to make a difference. It's still rising globally. We're going to get to 9.5 billion probably. We don't know of any humane or realistic way to reduce that. So focusing on reducing human population, however much our sort of hostility towards our neighbors for all the damage they're doing to the environment might work on us, that kind of almost anti-human attitude is maybe right, but it's not the solution because we don't have a way to influence it. Now, output per person, total output per person is standard of living. Well, around the world, not only is the standard of living rising, but we are not in any position to say to people in Africa or Southeast Asia, too bad, we got there, you can't. Consumption per person is not something we're likely to be able to affect. That's actually going to continue to increase. Realistically, the first two terms in this we can't do anything about. Well, what about the second one, the third one, the energy intensity? How much energy goes into producing things? Well, yeah, there's room to wiggle there. In fact, we've had some really important success in reducing the energy input for a whole bunch of goods. Now, what are we talking about? We're talking about a very gradual process that results from technological change. And we're talking about one that has decreasing returns in a sense. You get rid of all the most efficient things, inefficient things. Well, the ones that are left aren't consuming as much energy. So when you work on those, they're harder. You get less of a gain. So you've got a declining gain in that one. And it's happening. So we've got to win on the energy intensity, but real difficulty in accelerating the process. So that only leaves one thing. That leaves carbon intensity. And the problem here is really simple. If you're going to burn fossil fuels, it's high carbon intensity, which means that the only window that the IPCC saw, as they describe it using the K identity, is to work on carbon intensity. And they identify basically two paths. There are only two sources of energy that can replace fossil fuels: nuclear power and solar energy, either directly or through catching wind. Those are both from the sun. So we've got two alternatives to the fossil fuels that go into that. Both of them are technologically feasible. Both of them are economic. Both of them are actually well enough developed and deployed that we know lots about them. But they make up 15% perhaps of the world's electricity generation at most, and most of that's nuclear, I want you to know. And electricity generation makes up about a third of the energy consumption. 15% of 1/3 is not very much. It's not very much at all. It's around 5%. 5% of the energy we're using right now does not come from, well, I'm forgetting the hydropower in there and horses and a few other little things, but they're not very big. Say 7% doesn't come from fossil fuels. Okay, so I'm going to summarize and then I'm done. And the way I want to summarize is I'm going to get rid of this page. If I can figure out how, whoops, what'd I do? And ask you to look, if you can, at the board behind me. The board behind me has a, I don't think you'd call it an equation, but you'd call it something kind of like the K identity. And can you read this? Somebody nod or, no, you can't? Okay, well, I'll tell you what it says because it's pretty simple. I don't know why you can't because my students do it all the time. You can pin my picture. Do you know how to pin a Zoom thing? If you go to the Zoom and you go up to that little right-hand corner, there's 3 dots. And I think if you just click on those 3 dots, it says you, third line down is pinned to the first screen. And that should make it big. Well, if you want to make me big. That working for anyone? Craig got it. Janet looks puzzled. Tree has it. Laurie, how about you? Getting there? Oh, you got your mic off, so you can't even tell me what you're doing. Okay.
I got it.
No 3 dots.
3 dots. Pardon?
No 3 dots.
Didn't find them?
No.
Well, Zoom does definitely have 3 dots somewhere. And then it has a window that is the person speaking. So when you're pinning it, you are.
We're okay now.
Okay. Anyway, I'll try to talk through it if you haven't figured it out. Andy, are you okay?
Yes, I am. I actually wrote it down.
How are you? I'm not going to ask you, John. Okay. So there's a story. What we saw. Oh, I got a smile from John anyway. You okay? You can see this, can you, Erica? Okay. Well,
Yep,
the
I got
story
it.
is, if we think about the energy flow, it goes from our energy source through to our making of people, our educating people, because you got to keep the classrooms warm. You need light, you need, the whole process of our economy is producing people. That's what it's about. You can produce lots of people without education and clothes. It can produce people with lots of clothes and no education. It can produce people with lots of education and no clothes, which I'm starting to worry about myself at the moment. But basically that's the flow. So the way it works is we stick carbon in, we get energy. We use that energy to produce output. The output is divided up as consumption goods, and that makes the people. Okay, so there's the story. Now, if we think of what we mean by those three ideas, reducing the size of the economy, degrowth, is about this piece: reduce the consumption per person and the number of people. That's what it means. Decoupling means find some way to make sure that the CO2 that comes out of this stops. So decoupling means you're moving to nuclear or solar for your main energy source. That's the biggest single strategy we have for decoupling, for reducing the impact we're having on the globe. If we could stop eating meat, that would have a big effect. That would have a huge effect. If we could start producing our agricultural products in the cities, that would have a big effect. That would let us free up lots of land for others. So those are two other decoupling ideas. So down here, degrowth. Well, the circular economy is really just about doing this. So the circular economy is this piece in the middle. Okay. Now you can see why it's important to keep these ideas clear, because we have lots of fine people who are passionate advocates of all three of these approaches. And that's great. Some of them, according to the IPCC, are not very feasible. Degrowth, we can be a little more moderate in what we eat, but there's really severe limitations to how far we're going to get. The answer is that will not solve the problem, important as it is. There just are not enough opportunities in the circular economy model to cut the impacts enough. Again, a really important direction to go. It's like washing your hands, right? If there's a disease out there, you got to do it, but it doesn't stop the spread of the disease. Just keeps you a little bit safer. You're a little better off. So the big strategy, and this has to be the strategy for Greens, it has to be the strategy for all of us basically, is how do we replace fossil fuels? How do we stop the production and use of fossil fuels? Now, I'm not going to go into the 900 different things we have to do about that, but that is the one really big thing we can do. It's a political decision, because the truth is, so Laura, you probably fly to Florida every year, do you? No. You go by yourself, Barbara? No. Okay. So we can make a difference. Your mic is off, so I didn't hear it, Barbara. We can make a difference with individual decisions, but not very big. One concrete plant is a dozen cities worth of carbon emissions. Small cities, but yeah. It's the input of fossil fuels into the industrial process, and especially into our heating system, that we've got to find ways to stop. That takes some technologies, but we actually have the technologies. What it takes that we don't really have yet is guts. Now, I know Craig's got guts, Janet's got guts. Our politicians don't seem to have the kind of guts to really start the process. So as I said, there is zero time before we run out of carbon in our budget. Our government is currently hoping to get almost halfway there in 8 years. That's not very ambitious. That is not going to decouple us anything like fast enough. And countries like Canada have to be the ones that pilot these projects. We have to develop the technology. We have to pay the upfront costs. We have to take on the extra personal expenses in order for the markets to develop so the rest of the world can. So that's my story for today. I hope you like the three big ideas, the two big problems, and the Green Party. I'm done.
Well, thank you, David. For the Q&A portion of our meeting, I'm going to be taking a speakers list just to ensure everyone has an opportunity to ask questions or comment. To get on the list, you can raise your hand using the Zoom icons at the bottom of the screen. You can send a message through the chat, or you can unmute right now and let me know that you'd like an opportunity to be on the list. Please be mindful of time. We only have about 15 minutes left, so we want everybody to have a chance to ask questions if they want to. Okay? All right. I don't see anybody yet. Oh, John
Yes.
has a question. Okay.
Should we be limiting our immigration? Should we, Canada's wide open spaces, but how much really can we absorb? We have 36 million now. When I came on the planet, I guess we had something like less than half of that. But how much more can we go? Is there any sense in keeping adding more and more people to Canada? I know the world is going to 9.5 billion, but how about us here in our big section of the world? How much can we absorb, practically?
Wow. Slightly an extension of the topic. Well, we're not adding to the global population, but we would be bringing people from places where they have less consumption possibility to higher consumption possibility. In many cases, from colder places to warmer places, from warmer places to colder places. So they're going to need more heat. So immigration does raise global consumption. So that's a problem. What do the economists tell us? They tell us our economy, that's not the environment, John, but the economy would be more successful with more people. Essentially, what we know about economic productivity now is that it's people. For Ricardo, it was land 200 years ago. For Marx, 150 years ago, it was machinery. In the modern world, it's people that are the main source of wealth. Those people can stay somewhere else where they're probably not as productive, where their climate has deteriorated, where they don't have the capital. They will not contribute as much. Some of them can come to Canada where their productivity in global terms goes up. So that's a contribution. We're talking about more consumption, but more productivity. If you're worried about, I think that's a complicated issue and I don't really have an answer, John, but my sense is, one, there's going to be an awful lot of people who need a safer place to go. And Canada has always done a lot of that kind of accepting of refugees, climate and economic refugees. I think we can afford to, according to the economics. The other thing is, as the world gets rougher, and I think it's going to, being a larger country is going to make us safer. Being a large empty space is going to make us a real target for US expansion as they lose a lot of the Gulf states, as California loses its productivity, as Nevada becomes semi-uninhabitable and they can't grow anything there. There'll be people at our borders, and it won't just be people from Africa and from Russia and from Asia. It's going to be Americans at our borders. I think we're better off with more people. I'd rather have other than Americans personally, just because the Americans are going to bring guns and nobody else will. So I don't know if that's much of an answer.
Craig had a question in the chat.
Should I look at it, Craig? I'll look at it and see if. Give me 1 second to get a hat on. It's a bad hair day. I don't know what to do about that, Craig.
Go down a little further.
Okay, okay. Any good extra resources you can quickly think of off the top of your head relating to circle or decoupled economies? I'm kind of surprised, Craig, because I haven't found a lot of really good discussion of this. I have not found a coherent discussion of this anywhere else yet that I can refer you to. So if you join the International Ecological Economics Association, there's lots of papers where people are talking about various ways to do it, but nobody who summarizes it clearly in my experience. So I'm sorry, I can't really help with that one. Or maybe I have helped as much as you're going to get.
David, this is Andy.
Yeah.
I'd just like to make a little comment about the carbon and the energy. Like in talking about the politicians aren't making the decisions yet. I think there's a fear of actually beginning to do a business case analysis on this, because the outcome is going to point to actually doing the decarbonization compared to what we're doing now. And I think that is the big challenge. I think, like, just as a straight example, if we were to put the carbon numbers on all our fruits and vegetables in a grocery store, and then also let the people that grow fruits and vegetables in Canada, or in a house of some sort, in an outhouse or whatever, all year round, or underground all year round, then we would see that decarbonization happen by leaps and bounds, of course, based on the outcome of the business case. But isn't that what the problem is? Like, I would like to see every truck driver say, no more, you're now farmers. And here's an outhouse for you.
An outhouse.
Not an outhouse, a hothouse, sorry. But
yeah, I mean, people are going to have to change occupations, and the question that we're up against is, how do we get them to do it more quickly?
Yeah.
How do we get them to get excited about the changes they're facing? Right now, the dominant conversation is, oh, isn't this terrifying? They're going to take my meat away. They're going to take away my car. They're going to take away, and that discussion gets a strong response from people, even though it is fallacious.
I remember a while back when I was working on carbon and energy, I equated mine output, like ore. I equated a profitable product called energy in carbon dioxide sort of thing, and saying, okay, well, what's the value of mining geothermal? Like as you know, and I just can't believe that we in Sudbury, like when we had Calais Boreal, we could get geothermal with one drill hole and cut out all the natural gas completely from 3-4 public buildings all the way down that road. But the mining sector doesn't even consider the value of geothermal energy up on surface without putting anything underground or taking anything out except the energy itself. And we're already there. And this relates to the problem that how close we are, but yet how we don't have the attention of doing business cases.
Right on. Anybody else?
I was thinking, David, you and I are advocates for nuclear energy, but so let's say we build all the nuclear plants that are necessary to provide all the energy we have, but how about food? Because I mean, it's fine to have the energy, but you got to have something to eat as well. Is there a correlation there?
Oh, the obvious one is, unlike solar and wind, nuclear energy gives you lots of surplus heat. You can heat buildings, you can heat greenhouses. So if you want to move towards many of the changes we want, you want a source of heat. Heat is expensive. It's actually more expensive in terms of fossil fuel than mobility. Cars aren't very efficient, but they move you a long ways for a liter of fuel. A liter of gasoline won't heat a greenhouse for long. So I guess that says yes. I think that's one of the great advantages of nuclear power, especially in northern climates.
One of the things we're facing in Canada right now due to the pine beetle and the slow rate of growth in our forests, we've seen the price of lumber going up. Are we reaching a depletion point here somewhere, or is there going to be how much can we not afford going forward?
How much can we not afford?
If that's a correct
That's a
term.
good question. Anyone else got an answer to that? I'm a bit stuck here. Pat, you have answers for lots of things. How much can we not afford? I think you mean how much can we afford to delay on these issues, given the way the forest capacity seems to be declining now. There's a lot of contradictory writing about this, and Canada certainly has not engaged the issue of what's going to happen to the forest. The governments have not said, start to tell us everything you can about how we keep the forests collecting carbon and how we keep them growing so we have that resource.
Just a supplementary question there, David. Okay, some people say, okay, we're going to build everything with concrete. But then I understand that concrete is an enormous producer of CO2. Is that correct?
Yeah, for every ton of concrete, you release about 2 tons of CO2, approximately. If you compare that to using, say, mass timber in construction, which absorbs most of a ton, there's a 3 ton per cubic unit of carbon emissions difference between concrete and wood. And wood, of course, is lighter, so it actually doesn't take as much mass. You get more construction out of the same amount of wood.
One of the things we're looking at here in Sudbury is either building new buildings or restoring older buildings. And it would seem, according to the figures that I've looked at, that there's less CO2 emitted by remodeling or rebuilding than there is by building new. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. In terms of the structure, the great difficulty is a lot of older buildings are hard to heat efficiently.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes they may be tear downs for that reason, but we haven't actually worked hard on the technologies for moving existing buildings to the net zero point yet. There's some really interesting technology and research out there, but we haven't really brought that forward much in Canada.
Well, our time is up. Thank you so much, David, for a wonderful presentation. Lots for us to think about. And thank you all for joining us. Lori, John, Andy, Erica, Craig, Janet, and Pat, thank you so much for joining us. We hope you will join us again at our next meeting. Take care, everybody.
Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Bye.
Okay, thank you. From the wet coast.
Nice.